The Progressive Era was a time of widespread social activism and political reform, but for African Americans, life still remained a challenge. The Progressive Era / Gilded Age, like many other time periods throughout history, was a time of social injustice and inequality for African American people. In the South, sharecropping and black codes still prevented black people from success. But it was also during these times I would see the growth of the NAACP and see prominent figures such as W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington explain their theories on how exactly to attain equality in America. Today, we're going to dive into 5 different aspects of the African American experience during the Gilded Age. The first topic we're going to talk about is the NAACP. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP, was founded on February 12, 1909 in New York as a response to ongoing violence towards black people in the U.S. After a horrible riot in Springfield, Illinois, that killed 9 black people, a group of white liberals called for a meeting to discuss the racial injustice that was so prevalent in the U.S. at the time. Around 60 people, 7 of them being African American, and one of those African Americans being W.E.B. Du Bois, were at the meeting, and so the NAACP was formed. But what did they do from there, some may ask? A year after their first meeting in 1909, the NAACP started releasing a magazine called The Crisis, which for its first 24 years, Du Bois edited. The main focus of the magazine was on national issues, such as their help in persuading former President Woodrow Wilson to go against lynching, which was a massive issue facing black people at the time, but Amin will go into more depth on that later. Du Bois also published a children's version of The Crisis in 1920 called The Brownies Book, which was the first magazine in American history to be exclusive to black children, which helped the African American youth feel represented. Their work did not end in the Progressive Era, though, as they are still, as their mission statement reads, securing the political, educational, social, and economic equality of rights in order to eliminate race-based discrimination and ensure the health and well-being of all persons.
Black leaders have always condemned lynching, and for as long as it has existed, people in the black community have tried to stop it. From 1882 to 1968, there were 4,743 people lynched, 3,446 of them being African American, and in those instances, less than 1% of the mob members were prosecuted and punished. With the constant threat of the Ku Klux Klan, many African Americans lived with the risk of being lynched, and not even being able to have justice enacted on the mobs who committed such actions. Between the 1890s and the 1930s, as was mentioned before, states had laws put in place against mob violence, but rarely were these laws enforced. At the turn of the century, in 1900, black leaders would start openly condemning the acts of these mobs. A campaigner named Ida B. Wells even traveled to Great Britain in hopes of helping with resistance to racist violence. Many efforts made by the NAACP would also help in bringing down the numbers of lynchings. Led by James Weldon Johnson and Walter White, the NAACP would publicize the gruesome evils of lynchings. They would also lobby for a federal statute many times, but conservative senators would prevent their enactments each time. These efforts were still not in vain. The anti-lynching campaign provided a foundation for further civil rights crusades, and there would be an erratic decline in lynchings from the 1890s to the 1960s.
In 1892, an African-American train passenger named Homer Plessy refused to sit in the train car that was meant for black people. This story reminds me of Rosa Parks. However, instead of leading to a civil rights movement, Plessy's actions led to increasing segregation. This case was brought to the Supreme Court, as Plessy argued that his constitutional rights were violated. The court rejected this argument and ruled a law that implies merely a legal distinction between white people and black people is not unconstitutional. The Supreme Court then signed a separate but equal doctrine, upholding the constitutionality of racial segregation. This doctrine ruled that the protections of the 14th Amendment only applied to political and civil rights such as voting and jury service. In its ruling, Justice Henry Brown said that, consisting in the assumption that the enforced separation of the two races stamps the colored race with a badge of inferiority is not by reason of anything found in the Act, but solely because the colored race chooses to put that construction upon it. The separate but equal policy ensured the survival of the Jim Crow laws for the next half-century. Segregated bathrooms, hotels, theaters, swimming pools, schools, and dozens of other public facilities were now seen as commonplace. None of these were seen as a violation of the Constitution and continued to exist up until the 1960s.
Two of the most prominent African American intellectuals of their time, W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, brought theories, although different, with the same goal: attaining equality and diminishing racism in America. Booker T. Washington, born a slave, would study at the Hampton Normal and Agricultural Institute in Virginia, where he would graduate with high honors and move on to become the principal of a school in Tuskegee, Virginia. He would gather support from both white and black people willing to help improve the school, and would build his institution with 540 acres of land and an enrollment of 400 students by 1888. Washington would deliver his most famous speech at the Cotton States and International Exposition in Atlanta, which would lead to him being hailed as the next spokesperson for his race and the successor to Frederick Douglass. W.E.B. Du Bois, born in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, would first be introduced to racism when he went to the South to enter Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee. It is here that he would start understanding what he called the dual consciousness of the African American. He would receive a master's at Harvard, spend 2 years at the University in Berlin, return to the U.S. to teach at Wilberforce University in Ohio. Then he would accept a year's non-teaching appointment at the University of Pennsylvania to prepare a study. This study would be one of the first based on empirical sociological research, and showed Du Bois' belief that a black elite should lead the black masses using scientific methods. In 1897, he would become a professor at Atlanta University and would hold an annual conference on the study of African American problems. Du Bois and Washington would clash many times, Du Bois charging Washington's emphasis on industrial education over academics, limiting African Americans to low-paying jobs. While Washington had a tolerance for social inequality and political subordination, Du Bois never compromised in his belief that African Americans should be granted full political and civil rights. Washington would also be criticized for his vast network of graduates and followers, to which he used to silence his critics. He would try to weaken those who stood against him, such as the NAACP, founded by Du Bois. By the time of Washington's death, his philosophy on race relations would fade away, and Du Bois would continue to devote his life to his struggle for equality.
The film Birth of a Nation was released in 1915 and is widely considered to be one of the most controversial films in American history. Directed by D.W. Griffith, the film depicts black people, played by white actors in blackface, as dumb and sexually aggressive towards white women, and the Ku Klux Klan as heroes who stopped them and brought justice to the country. In terms of the box office, it was a massive success, but it brought up a lot of controversy all around the country. The same year it was released, the NAACP put together a campaign to have the film banned altogether, or at least to censor out the worst parts. Since they were only 6 years old at the time, the NAACP was not very well known around the country, so their campaign was not very successful in their goal to ban/censor the movie. However, their campaign did lead to an increase in membership and name recognition all around the country. This film was only a fraction of all the horrible things that black people had to endure, not only in the Progressive era, but all throughout history as well.
As you can see, the Progressive era was filled with ups and downs for the African American community. The Plessy v. Ferguson case, Birth of a Nation film, black codes, Jim Crow laws, sharecropping, and many other dreadful experiences occurred that prevented people of color from living an equal and successful life. Thankfully, things like the NAACP, anti-lynching campaign, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Booker T. Washington helped make a change. Although it seems like a lot of these issues have been solved, they haven't. A lot of these problems are still prevalent in today's world. People of color still aren't receiving the same treatment as white people do. We've come a long way since the progressive era, but there is still a whole lot of improvement to be done going forward.